According to the Radio Academy, in the time period between 1984 and 2004, there was one artist who far and away dominated British radio airplay. An artist who for those 20 years kept creating hit after hit and would even continue to do so beyond those years. This is about an artist as prolific as he was controversial, a fashion icon and a sex symbol who throughout his career battled against the media that were determined to pry into his privacy, more precisely under his sheets. We're talking about a composer who has made invaluable collaborations with other contemporary musicians, winning prestigious awards and establishing himself as one of the biggest standards of pop, although to honor the truth, he would not shy away from flirting with other genres, showing that no label was made to his measure. In this video, we are going to go through that career full of records, box offices on fire, drug abuses, endless controversies, and a constant and sometimes tortuous search for freedom. Our dance steps will take us to December 25th, 2016. The day George Michael died. The pop star's doctor would recount sometime later that 3 weeks before meeting his end, George Michael had announced with some resignation that he knew his health was deteriorating and that death, inevitably, was lurking around his luxurious mansion, waiting for the opportune moment to finally pounce on him. The professional tried to cheer him up and took the opportunity to emphasize to the singer that he needed to put emphasis and care into looking after himself. George responded with some witty phrase, always resorting to humor to evade some of the responsibilities he had never wanted to assume, that of taking care of himself. He had grown tired of repeating to the press that he did not regret having certain vices. He believed that this was his personality and preferred to endure the consequences. He had considered the matter closed on more than one occasion. Those last days, his body at 53 was no longer that of the proud and provocative teenager. In fact, his doctor even allowed himself to respond to his joke with another joke. He told him that he was looking more and more like Elvis Presley, and not exactly for his musical talent. He looked like the last Elvis who, when confined, couldn't stop eating sandwiches filled with jelly and peanut butter. George had swelled to such an extent that it had raised certain alarms in his environment. The doctor, although he perceived that things were not going well, did not assume that by the end of December the lady with the scythe would finally catch up with the elusive George. In 1984, resplendent and making his way in the music industry, George had composed the unforgettable Last Christmas, where he lamented having given his heart to someone who didn't deserve it. Precisely on Christmas of 2016, more than 30 years after the release of that song, his heart stopped beating, perhaps punished by the problematic consumption of various substances. However, the causes of death are considered natural. Dilated cardiomyopathy with myocarditis and fatty liver was the official verdict. His partner, the photographer and hairdresser Fadi Fawaz, with whom the singer had been linked since 2009, had spent Christmas Eve sleeping in his car, when the next day he had entered the house to try to talk with George and perhaps make peace. He had found him lying down and not breathing. He spent an hour trying to revive him before calling 911. However, George would not wake up again. Fadi's words when calling emergencies would be blunt. "He's gone. He's blue." Michael had been battling aggressive pneumonia in previous years and had survived a car accident. At the time of his death, he left behind more than 80 million copies sold, and a legion of fans mourning the loss of that falsetto that had wreaked havoc in the discos during the 80s and 90s. After that December, storms related to his inheritance would loom, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning of his story. Michael was born on June 25, 1963, and spent his childhood in North London, a place where his father, a Greek Cypriot, had emigrated in 1950. While his father was busy setting up a restaurant that would end up consuming all his time, and while his mother was trying to break into the show business with her dancer studies, George started wandering the streets at a very young age. There, in alleys and corners, he came across new musical trends that were slowly arriving in the country. Quickly in his head, old American soul songs began to coexist with new compositions that bet on the avant-garde. Without wasting time, at just 13 years old, George decided to dive into this fertile universe and compose his first song. He wanted his voice to become famous like those artists he listened to with fascination. His father would shake his head when he heard him singing around the house with undeniable disapproval, disappointed to see how his boy, in his opinion, was wasting time. George lamented not having anyone to share his passions with until he and his family moved to Radlett. Once they settled there, he started attending Bashi Meat School, where he met a young man who not only shared his interests, but also his desire to try his luck on stage. The boy's name was Andrew Ridgely. Together, they would form a band that in 2008 would be chosen as the best boy band of all time, beating rivals such as Backstreet Boys and NSYNC among others. Along with Ridgely, his brother and two other young men, George would form the ska group The Executive. But would this be the band of consecration? Well, not really. The Executive had a short life, and while it would visit some nightclubs, interest in this band would soon disappear. Far from being discouraged, George and Andrew decided to give life to a project where they could have better control. So they founded a duo, and this time we are talking about the band that would mark a before and after in the pop world. We're talking about the legendary and unique band Wham. Born in 1981, Wham! Enjoyed immediate popularity in nightclubs. The aesthetic proposal of the project, the cheerful and catchy melodies, and George's compositional quality earned him an early first record contract. But what was expected was very simple, that the duo would make good sales at the beginning and then disappear. The producers speculated about getting the most out of them and then continuing the search for more talents to squeeze. But they didn't know that one had come to stay. Just a few weeks after the debut album Fantastic was released in 1983, the singles that came from it positioned themselves in the top 10 of the radio station charts. Up to there, what was stipulated? However, when the album itself managed to reach number 1 in sales, the surprises did nothing but grow and grow. The same as the investments of those who trusted in the band. With one's second album would come Wake Me Up Before You Go Go. By that time, George and his partner were already international scale stars. George Michael then set a goal for himself. They already valued the band he was part of. Now he wanted to gain fame as a lyricist. To that end, he revisited a song he had written when he was 15 years old and made some arrangements. He adapted it to his now more mature voice and created an emblematic ballad that would amply demonstrate his versatility. We're talking about Careless Whisper, considered by critics as George's first solo song, who that same year would win the prestigious Ivor Novello Award for Best Songwriter of the Year. To continue making milestones, Wham! Became the first Western group to tour communist China, which earned them extensive media coverage. The audacity was seen as another example of the courage and avant-garde that the duo offered. By then, it began to be evident that George stood out above his partner. In live performances, he received the longest ovations, which started rumors about a possible and inevitable separation. On other occasions, the tabloids had made juicy speculations about this breakup, but this time, unlike the rest, the breakup would become a fact when the band released their last album in 1986 and set a date for their final concert at Wembley Stadium, a concert that of course sold out immediately. After that show, George left Wham behind to confirm his solo career. Many claimed it would be impossible for him to achieve the same fame he had achieved with the duo, and they didn't know how wrong they were. Immediately, George focused on the arduous task of composing and performing music for a more sophisticated audience. At first, he wanted to avoid his pop past, until he finally understood that pop was not at all a lesser genre, but a good starting point to build successes of all kinds. His first step as a soloist was by doing a praise duet with Aretha Franklin, an icon of American soul music. The repercussions were immediate, and the goal was more than achieved. Thanks to that collaboration, he would win his first Grammy Award. In the fall of 1987, George Michael released his highly anticipated first solo album. There he sang, produced, and played instruments, proving that he was at the peak of his talent. With his first music videos for that album, he began to generate controversy. In his creative universe, sex was a fundamental factor, which led to censorship falling on him quickly. The results, more and more diffusion. There's no such thing as bad press, only press that's poorly utilized. George Michael always knew how to use criticism to his advantage. Around that time, George began to confirm his taste for aesthetic reinvention. His image changes began to occur one after another, also establishing him as a major influence in fashion. Once again, he received nominations and awards. George Marco. However, despite his promising future and an ambitious world tour in 1988, George began to show signs of exhaustion and reluctance to be the figure everyone expected him to be. Suddenly, he found himself weary and constrained by the commercial machinery he had fallen into. He had started his career seeking freedom and was, in his opinion, increasingly captive to the demands of others. This situation would lead him to leave a stage full of conflicts. His second album was released in September 1990. George refused to do any kind of promotion for this album. Although sales were not bad, Sony, which expected much more, suspended the release of the author's future works, perhaps as a punishment. Would the musician's career end with this boycott? No. But it would start a time full of headaches. As a result of the dispute with the label, the musician couldn't release an album for the next 4 years, which didn't mean he wasn't still in the spotlight. Without going any further, in 1991 he would get another #1 by recording live with Elton John, who would soon become his friend. The following year, George Michael, along with other artists such as Guns N' Roses and David Bowie, would participate with the band Queen in a tribute concert to the late singer Freddie Mercury. There he made it very clear once again everything he had to offer, slowly becoming a treasure worth exploiting. Finally, at the end of 1994, he would release a new album, Older, and 2 years later he would give a long performance for a Music Television Unplugged. Among the audience that day was Leslie Angle Harrison, his mother, who would die of cancer the following year. This death would leave him devastated, as if that wasn't enough before he could recover. The press fell on him once again, this time generating a scandal that stirred up public opinion. In April of 1998, an undercover officer arrested George Michael for lewd conduct when he proposed to have sex in a public bathroom in Beverly Hills. Until then, the artist had never spoken in interviews about his sexuality, although there was much speculation about it. That move and the media coverage was morbid, unethical, and violent. Years later, George Michael would say that at 19 years old, while recording the second album of Wham, he had thought about coming out as bisexual to the whole world, but then, on the advice of those close to him, he had discarded the idea. He would add that he regretted not following his instinct. The silence had made him fresh meat for the unscrupulous. But the pop idol responded to the journalist's bullying with dignity and intelligence. When magazines and newspapers viciously attacked his sexuality, he made a decision that became a symbol. He requested an interview where he delivered an emotional, heartfelt, and gripping statement. He criticized society and himself, and championed his right to privacy and control over his life. He went from being considered a person who was ashamed of what he was, to becoming a reference for those who were afraid to come out of the closet. As the cherry on top, he responded to the controversy sparked by the bathroom incident by presenting a music video that ended with 2 men dressed in police uniforms sharing a passionate kiss. His comeback received a standing ovation. Tired of talking about himself instead of exercising his talent, he released an album in 1999 that compiled outstanding songs of the 20th century. Then came Patience in 2000 and 25 in 2006, where he collected his 25 years of career. In 2007, he unexpectedly returned to the headlines for reasons unrelated to his musical success. Perhaps in a cruel revenge of the press for the lost battle a few years ago. Knowing that they could no longer continue attacking him for his sexuality, they decided to focus on George's troubled relationship with drugs. In the aforementioned year, George received a 100-hour community service sentence for driving while intoxicated. His license was also revoked for 2 years. In 2008, he was arrested in a public bathroom in North London. He was charged with possession of illegal substances. In 2010, he crashed into a store window while driving under the influence of alcohol and cannabis. After that incident, he ended up in High Point Prison in Suffolk, United Kingdom. During his time behind bars, Paul McCartney wrote him a letter of support. In 2012, George released his 6th and final studio album. Shortly after, he had to check into a Swiss clinic to detox. He admitted at that time that he was smoking about 25 marijuana cigarettes a day. Then would come the decline of his health and his bloated days in true Elvis Presley style. Those days that started this story. The early extinction of a star left the world in shock. At the request of the family, neither the autopsy nor the toxicology test were made public. For many, it had been an obvious end. The last few years had been particularly dark for George. However, much remained to come to light. In the 2 years since his death, George Michael continued to make headlines, and as happened in his life, he appeared in all newspapers and media not only for the sales of his posthumous songs, but also for matters more personal, like the fight for his inheritance. A fierce battle that took place between his family and his partner. Although the dispute was finally resolved in favor of those who had a blood tie with the musician. Her last boyfriend didn't take long to make explosive statements. After being expelled from the mansion where he lived with George, Fadi Fawaz was seen in the area breaking vehicles. He was arrested for damages, for possession of a knife, and for drug possession. He stated he was angry for being left out of the will and blamed everything on a betrayal by the lawyers. Since then, he has attacked George's family and revealed that he took photographs of his lifeless body. In addition, Fadi claimed that the musician did not die of natural causes as the official report states, but rather took his own life. He added that he did it on Christmas Eve, not on Christmas, because that date marked the anniversary of his mother's birth. He also mentioned that George had had a few previous suicide attempts, but that no one wanted to talk about it. His theories were widely analyzed, and to this day many consider them valid. Others, however, say that Fadi is resentful and that George Michael, author of romantic songs that will forever remain in posterity, died of sadness. And yes, to justify that story, there is a tragic anecdote that we must know. It all would have started in 1990. In October of that year, on a trip prior to Rock in Rio 1991, which was to take place in January, George met the Brazilian designer Anselmo Felipa. The chemistry between them was quickly born. They started dating immediately, but in December, Felipa tested positive for human immunodeficiency virus. She flew to London to tell Michael in person. Those who study the artist's biography agree that this was a breaking point, more precisely the beginning of a rapid downward spiral that would worsen with the death of his love. Less than 2 years later, George would have carried a great deal of guilt about this, given that his partner, to protect him from what the press might say, had decided not to seek treatment. The day after Anselmo's death, a devastated George would have talked to his parents about his sexual orientation. By then he was 30 years old. It is said that 3 years of deep depression followed, or what he called the black hole. He had managed to get out, yes, but many argue that a part of him would have died after that this would have been the breaking point for his imminent and effective self-destruction. Exactly 3 years after his death, George's closest sister would die at 59 years old. Christmas then became a curse for the family. When he passed away, the musician was putting the final touches on Freedom, a documentary about his life. His friend and manager finished the work, which debuted in 2017. In it, George mentions that he hopes to be remembered as a person of integrity. In March of 2019, Christie's Gallery sold for $11.3 million the impressive collection of contemporary art that George Michael had gathered. A few months later, This Is How We Want to Get High was released, a song recorded in 2015 and included in the soundtrack of the movie Last Christmas, the only unreleased track from the artist so far. For a while, it was common to hear that George Michael was the paradigm of a person who had lived his way and under his own rules. Today, knowing his story better and in a slightly more conscious world, we can affirm that to live as he wanted, George Michael had to face a lot of pain. A pain often inflicted by a despotic society that praises the different only to then destroy it in a vicious way. And that's it for today's video. I hope you found the life and death of George Michael interesting. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and turn on notifications. I invite you to leave a comment with suggestions for possible future videos as we will be reading everything you write down below. Here are a few recommendations to continue binge watching on this channel. With that, I bid you farewell. My name is Magnus Mephisto and this was The Day That.